Hello and welcome to today's expert panel discussion on Iran and the divide between the US and the EU. There's a wide transatlantic gap between the two entities. Can we bridge it? How do we bridge it? My name is Nazi Moinian and I'll be moderating the discussion on behalf of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and I'm very pleased to be here. So there is a new horizon in the Middle East, but depending on how you look at it, you could also say this is a convergence of perfect foreign policy crises. Is Iran going to emerge out of this more powerful, more isolated, with a possible new American president in the White House, and presidency election in Iran in June 2021, the departure of Federico Mogherini, the one of the chief architects of the Iran nuclear deal and chief diplomat at the European Parliament, the signing of Abraham Accords with more states to follow, and of course, a new, more assertive player in the region, China, which is flexing its economic muscles throughout the Middle East and gaining political inroads. What does this all mean for the future of JCPOA, the future of US-EU relations, the future of the safety and security of Israel, but most importantly, what does it mean for the future of Iranian people themselves? Obviously, there are more questions that can be answered in less than an hour that we have to talk to our excellent panelists. So I do urge you to share your questions with us in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to you as best as we can. Our panelists today, our wonderful panelists today, are perfectly positioned to come up with brilliant answers. And if we don't get to brilliant answers, we can all agree that we can walk away better informed. Mr. Bart Grudes is a member of the European Parliament. Welcome, Bart. He is also the vice chair of Delegation on Iran's Affairs, Internal Affairs. He is also a member of the Committee on Foreign Relations and the Subcommittee on Defense and Security. Mr. Nader Iskoui is a senior Iran analyst to the US Central Command. Welcome, Nader. Good to have you. He's also a fellow at the Scowcroft Center, the Atlantic Council, and the author of the book Temperatures Rising. And my good friend, Kasra Arabi, who's an Iran analyst at the Institute, the Tony Blair Institute, and he's also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. So welcome to you all. And we don't have much time, so I'm going to delve right into our discussion. My first question would be to Mr. Iskoui. Nader, I was blown away by a little anecdote in your book that you talked about your experience with Khomeini in 1978. So I want to bring that up first as an introduction and as a way of a background to the rest of the discussion. So you're a student in the West, and you decide to fly over to Paris to meet with Ayatollah Khomeini. You express to him your wish to go back to Iran and be part of the revolution, and he tells you in no uncertain words, no, don't go back to Iran. We have enough revolutionaries in Iran. Go back abroad and drive the revolution abroad, which to me perfectly captures the essence of this regime. And we forget what this was in 1978, 1979, when Khomeini was coming to power. You've made a 180-degree turn. Now you're called one of the most trenchant oppositionists in the West. And you have shared that experience with your American counterparts. So can you tell us, in the 5 minutes time that we have allotted for this section, what your experience is, how did you change, and how did you impart your wisdom and knowledge about the regime to your American counterparts?
Well, when I did meet Ayatollah Khomeini in Paris, I was part of the student movement against the ancien regime. We thought that we did not have enough democracy. We did not have enough freedom in the country. And that did, although we both opposed the regime at the time, Khomeini and I were far apart on the solutions to the problems that Iran were facing. We were asking for a pro-democratic, pro-West government coming to stay in Iran, but respect the human rights, respect the freedom of speech. And Khomeini was in totally different space. And as you said, he made it very clear to me that his main goal was not just revolution in Iran, but for the whole Middle East. From the very beginning, they had this element of expansion of the Islamic Revolution into the Middle East. And later on, the extraterritorial branch of the IRGC, and which later became the Quds Force, came out of that line of thoughts. The first Shia militias that Iran actually organized were sent to Afghanistan to fight the socialist government in Kabul and later the Soviet Union. And then right after that, they organized the Iraqi dissidents in Iran, which later became the Ba'ath Force and became actually the center of the Shia militias in Iraq. So this trajectory has been going on for a long time. What they're doing in the region is not surprise to those of us who knew the founder of the revolution from beginning.
How did you impart your knowledge to your American counterparts, and how did they receive it? And what does the view from Washington look like right now? Because they have you as an advisor, so you can probably speak to us on their behalf as how is it that they see the regime?
I'm actually speaking with you today on my capacity as the senior fellow of Atlantic Council. So whatever I say does not necessarily reflect the views of the US government or the Department of Defense for that matter. As you alluded, there are some gaps, major gaps on Iran policy between US and Europe. And not so much on the substance, Nazi, but more, I think, on the best course of action to confront the challenges that we face. But there is a growing realization here in this town that the gap needs to be closed between the allies, and closed soon, in order to draft a unified transatlantic policy on Iran. Iran presents a number of significant challenges for policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. If we have time, I can identify some of the most important of those challenges and how we can bring the gap closer.
We will have time. I have more questions for you, Nader, as we continue. On the heels of the same question, I want to go to Castra and continue with the same region. Castra, you've written 3 papers, great papers on the Islamic Republic, on its leaders, on how the US has approached Iran over the years. Your last paper is on the IRGC. I want to get your view on what does it feel like to sit in Khamenei's seat in Tehran? What does it feel like to sit in Salami's seat, the commander of the IRGC in Tehran, knowing what we know today, that the arms embargo has lapsed. It was renewed by US as a unilateral sanction, but Iran is free to purchase arms on the open market. Their Qasem Soleimani is gone. Their Abraham Accords are happening, and more countries are signing on, and the sanctions regime has snapped back. So I feel like Iran is emboldened and emasculated at the same time. What do Khamenei and Commander Hossein Salami think at this point?
Sure, thank you, Nazi. Well, essentially, if we look at where Iran is today now and the changing landscape, there's a lot of talk in the West that the next US president will reach out and secure future talks with Tehran, attain a new deal that will cover aspects beyond the nuclear issue, and really a return, certainly if we have a Biden presidency, a return to the 2015 status quo. But as you rightly mentioned, the landscape has completely changed. In Iran itself, there are three key differences. The first relates to the Iranian streets and Iran's domestic situation. So in the past 3 years, we have seen frequent unrest on the Iranian streets, continuous waves of protests. And while economic sanctions have certainly contributed to bringing people onto the streets, homegrown problems, not least rampant corruption and increasing state repression, have been also the main drivers for that. Crucially, unlike before, certainly unlike 2009, the protests in the past 3 years have been distinctively anti-regime. As we last saw in November 2019, where civilians took to the streets, and in less than 2 weeks, the state security forces killed 1,500 Iranians. And if we track the trend of unrest in Iran, we see that protests are increasing in size, in scope, and are becoming more violent in nature. And this trend is going to be accelerated by the human and economic consequences of the pandemic. And that's something, by the way, Iranian regime insiders concede. So the first factor, the first changing aspect of the Iranian landscape is unrest, and any future talks with Tehran will take place against the backdrop of frequent protests, which will be really hard to ignore and place a significant amount of pressure on the next US administration to condemn any violence against the Iranian civilians. The second changing factor, which relates to both Khamenei and Hossein Salami, or the IRGC more broadly, is the expansion of the IRGC. We're currently in a process where the IRGC is transforming from the state, from the deep state rather, to the state itself. We've seen that this year the IRGC's power expand at an unprecedented scale. They de facto control the Iranian parliament and have now set their eyes on the Iranian presidency. But far from being a coup against the clerical regime, the empowerment of the IRGC has the full backing of Ayatollah Khamenei, who is seeking to ensure that his hardline Islamist vision is preserved after his demise. So we hear a lot of the times in the West and West-centric analysis that Trump's maximum pressure policy has led to the empowerment of the IRGC. But actually, the expansion of the IRGC is a direct product of Khamenei thinking about succession. And this will have implications, certainly in Iran domestically, which will see a more securitized Iran, but also in the region. It's likely to accelerate Tehran's support for Shia militia groups, as Nada mentioned. And really, a lot of these relationships Iran has with these militants are deep-rooted in ideology. They're not just financial or transactional relationships. In turn, although the next US president may offer sanctions relief as a way to, or as an incentive to descale Iranian activity in the region, no amount of sanctions relief or material rewards will reduce the IRGC's appetite for that kind of militancy. So that's...
Let me, because then I will have no more questions to ask you.
Sure.
I have a host of other questions on the role of the next president, American president, if we have a new president. So I'm sorry, but I just wanted to have Bart say from what the view from Brussels looks like. Bart, I was pleasantly, I have to say, surprised. I was listening to your very passionate plea in front of the European Parliament. This was when the arms embargo was going to expire in a week or so. And you said to your colleagues at the European Parliament, this is bad news. I'm quoting you, very bad news for everyone living in Israel, Lebanon, Yemen, and also in the EU. And you continue to say, here lies a task for Europe. I ask for some assurance. Are talks with Beijing and Moscow ongoing? And this is in reference to your fear that Iran will go on a buying spree of arms with in Moscow and Beijing. And then you said, can you assure me that we're doing everything we can? So I wanted to ask you about the relations, the reaction of your colleagues in the EU. Were they forthcoming to what you said? Can you summarize what's the European Union's position on Iran?
Yeah, first, thank you for having me. It's a great question. It was passionate because I feel passionate about it. As first vice chair of the Iran delegation, we have direct contact with our Iranian colleagues. But this was also, the target audience here for this speech was also Mr. Borrell, which is the High Representative of the European Union. And how did he respond? Well, he said, I share your concerns, he said, but we didn't actually agree on actionable deliverables and practical follow-up. His political assistant asked for the written speech I gave, so that's encouraging, but I won't start pushing because not much has happened. But strategic weapon sales from China, especially China, Russia to a lesser extent, they want hard currency, and China doesn't really bother for that. But that could affect, for example, air superiority for the West in the Middle East. It could have irreversible footprints from China in the Middle East. And I was worried about that. And I want the Iranians to be able to reach out for Europe, also in 10 to 20 years. So I'm worried about the strategic dynamics in the Middle East and the weapon deal in particular. That was very urgent. It was 11 days before October 18.
Do you feel like you've made any traction on this? Do you feel like your concerns were heard and hopefully we'll have a more assertive EU with respect to Iranian foreign policy?
Well, I've repeated my plea in 2 or 3 different occasions, and I always try to do that and keep on doing it. I'm not sure, because time is running out. As you know, we have upcoming elections November 3rd. We must act very quick. Well, listen, we can talk about it later, but there's a lot of political will in the European Union, but there's a lack of practical will, practical ability to act, and that's a problem in itself. But mainly the debates have been concentrating about JCPOA, and how our posture versus the transatlantic posture, and how we can make sure that no nuclear weapons are being developed in Iran.
Right. I understand that the chief concern of the European Union has been the nuclear clauses in JCPOA, because they are insisting that as a nuclear deal, it's meant to do what it was meaning to do, which is stop Iran from rushing towards a nuclear bomb. But there are sorts of other issues that Iran has been engaged in, and we'll get to it soon. And Nader, I want to go back to you again, if I may. So as the foreign policy scholar and a advisor to Central Command, I want you to make sense for us, and you were going to actually continue on that discussion. Why is it that the view towards Iran is so different in US than EU, and what can be done about it?
Nazi, I really believe that views are not that much apart. As I said before, it's the how to tackle those issues that have divided the Europe and US in the past few years. First, I think there is a growing understanding in this town that the US needs to come to terms with Europe on any future policy on Iran. Now, depending on what will happen on Tuesday on the US election, we can have 2 takes on that issue. If the unless all the national polls are and state polls here are wrong, we might expect a Biden victory on Tuesday. Suffice to say that if Trump is reelected, the basically the policy would be basically the continuation of the current policy with some variation, probably to force Iran into negotiating table, expecting Iran to adhere to that, coming to table when faced with 4 more years of the maximum pressure campaign. But let's examine the more likely course of action by Biden if he should win the election. The view from here is that under a Biden administration, we should have an agreement with Europe first before we actually approach Iran on issues of contention with Iran. And there are a number of issues. Above number one, and most important of that, is the nuclear issue. Iran is accelerating its enrichment of the uranium and adding to its stockpile. And we know from past reports that they already have the capability and design for nuclear devices. These are the 2 steps necessary to produce a nuclear device. Having a nuclear Iran is unacceptable to both US and Europeans. So this is a very much a common view among us all. That means that we have to stop, Iran needs to stop uranium enrichment under IAEA inspections. It needs to implement IAEA additional protocols. Its sunset clauses needs to prolong or taken out all the way. But we need to come with an agreement with the Europeans first on that before we move on to a new agreement with the Iranian and nuclear deal. So, then there is issue.
Nader, I'm sorry. I want to ask Bart to comment on this because you started by saying that there's not that much of a difference between where EU stands on Iran and where US stands. And Bart alluded to the fact that it's more a matter of practicality than principle. Bart, am I correct? And if there is not much of a difference between where the 2 entities stand, where is it that they're different? And if EU is coming on board with the Biden presidency, can you comment on what you expect Russia and China to do?
Well, for sure, but that's an interesting question. Well, first of all, the Europeans have a vivid memory of how the JCPOA deal was achieved. It wasn't easy. Remember in 2012, 2013, about enrichment, many reports came out, and no one was certain that we could get a deal. No one. I mean, Lavrov putting pressure on Zahiri in the last hours, it was very exciting, and then we got the deal. But Europeans still celebrated it as a diplomatic success. And now the Trump administration seen this differently. They see also the other malign activities from Iran, like the domestic oppression, the terror proxies, the destabilization of the region, etc. Whereas the Europeans would say, well, this is a strictly nuclear posture and a nuclear deal and not a global deal. Because if you would have that stance like the Trump administration has, a chance of a deal would be nearly near to zero. But having said that, it's a new fact on the ground. So Tuesday we will see who will win. And I think, for example, if Biden would win, for example, let's just hypothetically think that, then he cannot say, well, I'll have the JCPOA and lead that to Congress, but Congress will oppose it. We would definitely need to address some of the concerns that the Trump administration has also raised with good standing. I mean, those are real concerns. And I think Europe must address these concerns in order to get a new deal going, because that's the only thing that Europe really wants. We want to shed a positive light on the world and do that by getting a new deal done. No ifs, no buts, like you say in the UK, but it's very important that we get a new deal done and get people on the negotiating table back again. And that means that lifting sanctions would be a first step. I think that the Europeans can do more. We can deliver humanitarian aid, COVID-19 aid. We could have Instax play its role, and we could definitely show there's an alternative. And I think getting them on the negotiating table is quintessential. And I have a proposal for that later on how we should do that.
So we'll come back to the Russia and China question later on. I want to go to Castra. Castra, your paper on IRGC that has haunted me ever since I read it when it came out, has a fundamental request from the West, and that is, do not overlook the Shiite Islamist extremist vision that IRGC indoctrinates in its recruitees. And on the heels of that, the United States has designated the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, something the EU and the UK have not. The EU has designated Hezbollah, which is the student of the IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization, but not its parent company, the IRGC. So there's a disconnect there. But I want you to tell us what happens with the 2021 elections. What if more power is given to the IRGCs? That spells to me like a scary scenario where nothing good will come out of your predictions of, I mean, your predictions are excellent, but what if the IRGC wins?
Well, I think we are seeing, moving forward, the militarization of Iran's regime. And if we look forward to, first of all, Khamenei's made it absolutely clear. So we shouldn't be, we're not in for a surprise, I don't think. He has said that he wants the new government to be young and Hezbollahi. So he's already outlined that he wants a hardline candidate. If we look at the front runners at the moment, we've got at least 4 or 5 candidates that are either aligned with the IRGC or the Basij. It's very likely, we've seen, for example, Hossein Tehran, who was Rouhani's former defense minister. He has served in Ahmadinejad and also Khatami's administrations. He is in a very strong position to take the presidency. And that in itself will create a lot of problems for the next US president. It will be very, of course, all high-level decisions are made by the supreme leader. We often in the West think that, you know, Rouhani was the reason why Iran came to the negotiating table. Well, it wasn't. It was Khamenei giving the green light. So the presidency style does matter, but it mainly matters, I think, for policymakers in the West who don't want to look foolish sat around the table with, you know, someone like Ahmadinejad, you know, someone like Hossein Tehran, who co-wrote Hezbollah's charter, who played a role in the US Iran hostage crisis. So that in itself presents a lot of problems. And I think the IRGC is in a strong position to take the presidency precisely because of the issue of Khamenei's succession. Khamenei is preparing Iran for a post-Khamenei Islamic Republic. We see that trend. We've seen it in the judiciary. We've seen it in the parliament. And the last part of Iran's government is the presidency. And I think we will see that. And again, it presents a lot of difficulties moving forward.
Thank you, Castra. Nader, I want to bring this question to you, and for the sake of disclosure, I have written both for and against the Iranian nuclear deal. The last essay I wrote was in defense of the maximum pressure campaign. So having said that, I wanted to ask Nader, what does the continuation of a maximum pressure campaign look like? Where do we go if we're already at the maximum, if the Trump presidency continues for the next 4 years? And more importantly, does maximum pressure mean maximum outcome? Do we want a regime change?
The maximum pressure campaign under the current administration is set up to force Iran to come into negotiating table, basically on the US terms. Now, if the president is reelected, I expect a continuation of the same policy, with the expectation that the Iranians are seeing that the current administration will be in power 4 more years, will be more agreeable to come to a negotiating table because they do not want to have the same maximum pressure campaign continued on their re-elected administration. But if the elections goes the other way, would be a really different atmospherics on that. What I said about the nuclear deal with the Europeans is not that we agree on everything, but we agree on the basic tenets of that nuclear deal, that we do not want to allow a nuclear Iran. How we stop that and how we go about it are the issues that we and the Europeans should agree on before we approach Iran on a new deal. And it's not just the nuclear. That's the easiest part. We have the issues of the missiles. US expects Europe to address the growing threat of Iranian missile program, either as part of a new nuclear deal or a separate agreement. The transatlantic understanding on this issue should be reached again before we approach the Iranians. There are issues of the Shia militias. Nazi, the threat is growing rapidly in the region. In 2020 alone, there were 50 attacks on US facilities by the Shia militia groups in Iraq. Iran needs to dismantle that network. If not, US and Europe should jointly contain this threat and find a way to stop the expansion of the militia activities in the region. Then, of course, it was the arms export to militia groups. Iran is giving the highest, the most advanced weapons to the militia groups. Now, after the UN embargo is ended, they're going to facilitate that much sooner and much faster. We have to find a way to come with the alternative agreement to UN embargo between US and Europe on how to contain the expansion, proliferation of the Iranian arms in that area. And quickly, if I can say, there is also, I'm sorry.
Go ahead quickly.
There is also a concern if President Trump loses the election about the between Tuesday and until he is in the office, in that 2.5 months, there is a concern that we might face some serious issues concerning Iran, because I think let me put it bluntly, the concern is that Iranians perceive the loss as the dramatic weakening of the Trump administration, and they put into action their plans to launch attacks on US personnel facilities in the region, probably through their proxies, to avenge Soleimani's death, to avenge the sanctions imposed on the country by President Trump. Of course, such attacks would face the very decisive US response. And in the current tense situation in the region, it could escalate into a regional conflict. So that's a concern, and we should be vigilant to maintain peace and order in the region.
We should. Thank you, Nader, for that. Bart, I want to go to you. Nader just pointed out that the IRGC is proliferating across the Middle East. And obviously, one way you can keep yourself afloat is by a flow of money and funds. And IRGC has monopolized many industries. Can you tell us, should we be worried about the new Iran-China deal, 25 years, maybe $400 billion? There's a new weapon in the Middle East, and that's called the Chinese cash. How do we counter the Chinese cash?
That's a very, very good question, which we read far too little about. I've written a question in the Dutch Financial Times, but it's about this. It's the Chinese have recently launched a blockchain service network, and you're going to say blockchain. What does that has to do with Iran? Well, just bear with me for 30 seconds. So with blockchain, you can do transactions within the Belt and Road Initiative realm. That would mean you would offer a harbor, a railway, or whatever. You would program which companies could provide it, what number of cash, for how long, etc. The entire contract can be programmed. Now the innovation has come from China that they are delivering this autumn a digital currency, the DCEP, the digital currency electronic payment, and that is the I must say, it's an alternative financial monetary system. It provides people and countries to go along aside the dollar restriction regimes that the Americans have imposed. So it would provide an alternative monetary system, which the dollar sanctions would have no realm at all. And that is very important. And striking a deal with Iran for 440 billion, I must say, dollars is interesting, but providing them with an alternative means to buy anything they want from the Chinese is more interesting. And I think the Chinese will definitely be interested in getting a footprint in the Middle East, for example, naval bases, air bases. Their debt trap policy is very much known around the world, and why would Iran not follow? And the parliament might be obstructive to the deal, but I think the only one in charge here is the Ayatollah, and he will decide whether to proceed or not. It's sensitive, but I'm sure that the Chinese will do it. And I'm sure that Iran might even become a sort of a vassal state of the Chinese Xi Jinping. And that's worrying to the EU as well, because our outreach to Iran would be deplored by that fact as well.
Castor, thank you, Bart, for that. We're running out of time for my questions. I think I'm going to put the last question to Castor, and if Nader wants to also add a few insights on his own. Fast forward to 4 years, whether it's the Biden presidency or it's the Trump presidency, what do we do to empower the Iranian civil society to let them have a say-so in their future? How can the EU and the US help?
It's a good question. I think one of the most important, I suppose, aspects would be to any form of agreement with Iran to include aspects of change on the Iranian ground itself. I think that's something that we didn't see, obviously, with the JCPOA. And I suppose it would be a staged process where sanctions relief would be based on a change of behavior. Whether that's achievable, I mean, it's unlikely, but it can certainly form part of the discussion. We saw as well, in November 2019, Iran caused a complete blackout in terms of internet, to effectively censor the bloodshed, delay the response, the international response to its heavy-handed approach to the protests, the anti-regime protests. The US has certainly explored or discussed, preventing the authoritarian abuse of the internet. That's something I think that both the Europeans and the Americans can certainly work towards. There's shared interest there. Iran itself, the regime, is looking to, you mentioned the 25-year agreement. I think the most important aspect of the 25-year agreement is actually issues relating to telecommunications. Iran looking for Chinese software and material for domestic suppression. They saw the Iranians were closely monitoring what was going on in Hong Kong and how effective the Chinese regime was through the use of technology to suppress the protests. That's something that Iran is very, very keen to obtain. And obviously preventing Iran or Tehran from attaining such material, I think, is both in Washington and in Europe's interest. Going back to your question, I think how to empower the Iranian people, I think that does, again, the domestic situation being part of a broader agreement would be, or at least opening talks on some form of shift in behavior in return for sanctions relief or staged sanctions relief. I think that would be something that would be certainly welcomed on the streets of Iran. We didn't see that obviously with the JCPOA, and that led many people in Iran. We saw the consequences of that were that the Europeans certainly prioritized the JCPOA above everything else, and Iran really sought to exploit that. Every time Iran stepped out of line, it would say to the Europeans, or the Europeans would fear, that if they punish Tehran on all the other outstanding issues, from domestic human rights abuses to regional activities to ballistic missiles, the Europeans feared that the Iranians would walk away from the deal. So changing that status quo, I think, will be in itself really important.
Thank you, Castor. Nader, I'd love to go to you, but I'm sorry, I have to go to the Q&A. And if we have a little bit of time, Nader, I would invite you to add to Castor's brilliant remarks. Our first question is from Rory McLeod. Rory, I'm going to try to unmute you so you can ask your own question. Go ahead, Rory.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, thank you to all the panelists so far for a really interesting discussion. My question is for all the panelists. So Rouhani has been a key advocate of the nuclear deal for the past 8 years. As he is now set to stand down, there is a risk that he'll be replaced by a more hardline conservative figure, with members of the IRGC set to stand in the election. If this were to happen, can the nuclear deal be saved even if Biden wins the US presidency? Thank you.
Anyone wants to take that? Nader?
Sure. The policy regarding the nuclear program in Iran is actually led in the office of the Supreme Leader, by the Supreme Leader himself and by the close associates of Supreme Leader. Rouhani had a role in it, of course, but if Rouhani leaves and the hardliners comes in, doesn't really the Supreme Leader's policy on that would not change. I think they want to continue enrichment. They want to get ready for building a nuclear device, but stop on that. So do not actually build the bomb until they think they have to do it. I think that's the kind of a policy is going to continue.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question. We want to go next to Hassan Khanenji.
Thank you. I was just wondering, will the maximum pressure campaign succeed without the support from the Chinese and the Russians, who don't seem to be playing ball, especially with regard to China at the moment, to Iran at the moment?
Anyone wants to take that
question?
Well,
there you have it, right? There you have it. So if there's alternatives to US superdominance and power, I would be very displeased if that were to bring about in the world, but China is a rising power, and if they were to offer alternative systems, that would be very unbeneficial to pressurize the Iranian regime, would it? So that's why a swift action from the White House is very, very important, and therefore I would say, why not let European leaders from all institutions, I mean, I've spoken 11 days before the arms embargo ended, and I'm speaking 4 days before the new election. And I think we have very little time to speak to presidential advisors from Biden, for example, to negotiate amongst each other what would be the new posture to broker a deal. Listen, without the Europeans, this deal wouldn't have been there. I'm certain. One of the main goals that Kasra has always mentioned is a divide between EU and US. That's one of the main policy goals of the Iranian regime. Now, if you would think of that you couldn't grant a strategic success to the Iranian regime to have the US on board and not the EU. And so the US has a clear interest in keeping the EU on board, but I think that all of us, the West, has a clear interest in keeping China and Russia on board. Just remember how Lavrov has actually put pressure on Zarif during the JCPOA in the last hours. That was decisive, I think. And without the Chinese, that deal wouldn't be very effective, because they would be, like I previously said, might be in control of many of the aspects of the Iranian state. So then swift and very quick action should be what we should be doing.
Let me just add just one point. I totally agree that we do need, the US do need under a new administration or even under the current administration to come with terms with Europe on Iran policy. What can we do? I think one of the things can we do is like this institution, the Tony Blair institution, which I'm grateful for giving us this chance to have this discussion today. They can stand up a task force for transatlantic unity, because these are for the next 2.5 months, if we're going to have a transition team, or if you have a reset team under Trump, is key for us to get to them and bring in both the views of the both sides of the Atlantics, co-chaired by personalities of politicians, diplomats that are accepted on both sides of the Atlantic, like the chairman of your group, Prime Minister Blair, and an American counterpart, and to go and have extensive discussions during this key period, next 2.5 months, to prepare the way for a true transatlantic agreement before we approach Iran.
Thank you very much. Nader, stay on because I have a question from Gina Del Tito.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for your comments and for this time today. I'm based in the U.S., so it's really refreshing to hear a very different foreign policy perspective in the lead up to the election. So my question is, should the U.S. is the U.S. considering a regime collapse? Should they be? How likely is that? And therefore, what would be their options? Thank you so much.
No, right. That was
yes.
a question.
No, a regime collapse is not in any way or shape favorable to either US, to the Iranians, or to the region. We do not want to have a country out of control and the regime collapses on itself. So that's why it's so important that we start efforts to bring Europe and the US together to address the Iran questions in a much more broader than just a nuclear agreement. So we can bring back some peace and stability to the region. Collapse of the regime is not favored by anyone.
Can I ask a short question for this to Kasra?
Please.
So it's like if you were the Iranian regime right now and you were to see all this pressure, maximum pressure coming at you, what is the message that this Trump administration is trying to send? Because the question being asked by Ms. Del Tito is very, very, very valid. I'm not certain what they want. What are they into a regime change? Bolton might be, but is the rest? I mean, how are they now? How should we interpret their signals and their sanctions and their pressure?
Sure, I mean, certainly from Iran's perspective, regardless of who's in the White House, they would see as any form of policy, having the implicit or explicit goal of changing the regime. Obviously, they feed off this as well for their own purposes, their own ideology, anti-Americanism being at its core. So really, I think for Iran at the moment, I think the top priority in Khamenei's mind is ensuring that he can secure his legacy after his demise. That's his top priority. I think that will affect his calculus, even if we have a change in administration and the administration looks to reach out to Tehran. At the back of his mind will be to secure his legacy, and anti-Americanism is a key ingredient to his worldview. So even if we do reach an agreement, or even if we have Iran and the US sit behind a table, I don't think it's going to lead to a shift in the Islamic Republic's hostility to the US. Again, because that is at the crux of Khamenei's worldview and the Islamic Revolution's ideology.
I just want to add that I just finished reading the Riyat al-Faqih, which is a compilation of all of Khomeini's speeches through 1960s and 1970s. And the second paragraph is exactly that, Kasra. It's an anti-Semitic vitriol against the Jews around the world, the Zionist regime, the imperialist regime, and demanding them that the Muslims get up and topple these entities. So to your point, it's very much embedded in the DNA of the Islamic Revolution. I want to go to Olivier Amory for the next question. Olivier? Are you still there? Okay, maybe not. How about David Haney for the next question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I'd just like to ask the panel whether they I mean, there have been several ideas put forward that reaching out to the Iranians should have as a condition some change in their domestic policy. I think that, frankly, would be unnegotiable with the present regime and the probable winner of the presidential election in Iran. Secondly, to put on the table all the concerns about Yemen, Syria, and so on, not likely to be any more fruitful than it was when the Americans negotiated the JCPOA. So would the panel not agree that perhaps if there were a Biden administration, the best place to start would be to start, obviously on a basis agreed between the Europeans and the Americans, on discussing the sunset clauses in the JCPOA? We're getting quite close to some of them now, when the limitations that were negotiated then lapse. And frankly, if Iran is not prepared to extend those in time further, there's not much point in thinking that there'll ever be a deal.
Any of our
Just I'll let Nader go first.
Nader, go ahead first.
No, I believe that's a very good question. Nuclear program in Iran, I don't think is immediately the most dangerous issues that we face. Iran's regional behavior is actually in very short term is much more dangerous than their nuclear program. So a transatlantic agreement before we approach Iranians should definitely address the problems of ballistic missiles and the Iran regional policies, as well as the nuclear policy, because without them, we're going to have the same problem that the Trump administration faced, that they had concern about regional activities, they had concerns about ballistic missiles, and they decided to walk away from nuclear deal. So in order to ensure a long-term solution, or at least a medium-term solution to the Iranian problem, we should have consider all of those in a unified way between US and Europe. Thank you.
Just on the point on the sunset clauses, I do agree that's an issue of huge concern. I remember in 2018, a senior Iranian official was in London and spoke at a meeting in Parliament. And one thing that he was also a senior Iranian negotiator. He said that after the sunset clauses, Iran will have a full-scale enrichment program, as according to the terms of the agreement. There was obviously disagreement on that issue. And that is certainly, the clock is ticking. And that is certainly a major issue on both sides of the Atlantic. Again, that is why the transatlantic gap needs to be bridged, and we need to have a unified Iran policy. And even on the region, of course, it's going to be very, very difficult to reach any form of agreement. But again, Iranian officials who were negotiating the nuclear deal said very clearly that the Americans tried to press on the region, but this was something that they weren't granted to discuss. So although these disagreements, of course, exist, if the West goes in as a unified bloc, I think there will be certainly much more leverage if there's a united transatlantic policy that can put pressure on Iran to shift its behavior and reach a bigger or more comprehensive agreement than the JCPOA. Because the JCPOA, as I mentioned, from Tehran's perspective, it was a real win because of the priority, certainly the Europeans showed, prioritizing the deal above all other issues. So I think that certainly, to address that, the solution is a transatlantic, united transatlantic policy on Iran.
Castro, I'm going to jump in, and I want to act as a participant rather than a moderator. And I want to ask about sunset clauses to all three of you, and maybe this is a way to close the session because we're running out of time. Do they even mean anything? Because I have read your writings and also Nader's book, and you both point to the fact that the IRGC has become a zombie entity in a way that even if the regime collapses, the IRGC will outlive the regime forever. It has global connections, it has industries around the world, it has made political inroads into as far away as Southeast Asia and South America. So if this entity is here to stay, can't they just read out the 2015, 25-year clauses? Is it even meaningless to have these clauses in there?
It is not meaningless, Nazi, because these kind of agreement and these kind of clauses within the agreement, if Iran signs off on it, would modify the behavior, at least for now. Doesn't mean that because the agreement is signed, we're going to file it and then we say we have no Iran problem. Of course not. It has to be watched very carefully. Yes, Quds Force could remain in the Middle East with all the resources they have, even if the regime in Iran is overthrown. But that doesn't mean that we cannot and we should not come with those kind of agreement, because it would mitigate the problem for a time being. But however, we never trust that until we say it's verified 100% by that regime, and they don't. Then there are other ways other than just agreement to end the nuclear program in Iran.
Thank you, Nader. Castro, you on this matter, quickly?
So yeah, just echoing everything Nader said. The Quds Force, as Nader rightly highlighted, has been designed to outlive the Islamic Republic. Does that mean that the West shouldn't reach or push for a comprehensive agreement with Iran? No, I don't think it does. But again, coming back to that key point, at present, Tehran has been able to exploit that gap that exists between Europe and the US completely to its advantage. And in doing so, it has been able to, essentially have its actions unchecked on other issues. So bridging that gap, I think, is absolutely essential. And hopefully that's something that can be achieved in the near future.
Okay, that brings us to the end of the discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't get to at least 5 or 6 other very interesting questions about the role of China, Iran, Russia, the E3. They were all fantastic questions. It's just very limited amount of time. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nader. Thank you, Castro, and thank you, Bart, for an excellent panel. And hope for a free and democratic Iran. Thank you for all the participants for tuning in. And hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did.